Greetings. This is Jeff Riddle. I'm the pastor of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Louisa, Virginia. And in this episode of Word Magazine, I want to offer a supplement to the brief series that I've been doing of reviews of the recent debate, the debate that was held in February between apologist James White and independent Baptist pastor Thomas Ross regarding the texts of Scripture. Should one adopt the modern critical text, as James White advocates, or should one adopt the Textus Receptus? And of course, they were also talking about what's the proper basis for translations, like the Legacy Standard Bible, which is based on the modern critical text, or the Authorized Version, which is based on the traditional text, the TR, in the New Testament, the Masoretic text in the Old Testament. But part of that debate, one of the key points that was made by Thomas Ross as an objection to the modern critical text was a problem that in the modern critical text, in its printed editions, whether the United Bible Society's edition or the Nestle-Aland edition, it has sequences of words, phrases, that extends to whole verses and even several verses, where it chooses a reading using its eclectic method that actually cannot be found in any extant manuscript reading precisely or exactly in the same way. And so this is a problem for those who embrace the modern critical text, especially when they're critical of something like the Textus Receptus, because as James White says, you can't accept Ephesians 3:9 because the reading, the fellowship of the mystery, only appears in one extant manuscript, even though it does appear also in the 2nd century church father or early ecclesiastical writer, I should say, Tertullian of Carthage. But because it's a minority reading, he says, it must be rejected. But that's a problem for you to say that if you're also at the same time embracing the modern critical text, which in many places has readings that can't be found in any extant manuscript or in very few extant manuscripts. And so anyways, Thomas Ross was making this argument. James White, in fact, didn't seem quite to understand the argument. Thomas Ross was drawing on, I know at least at one point in one of his slides, he referenced an article written by Maurice Robinson. But this argument, I think, is put forward very ably by Maurice Robinson. Maurice Robinson is now retired, but he was for many years a professor of New Testament at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, a Southern Baptist seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina. And he's probably the foremost contemporary proponent of so-called Byzantine priority. And if you have a copy, as I do, of Maurice Robinson's The New Testament in the Original Greek, Byzantine Platform 2005, which was compiled and arranged by Maurice A. Robinson and also William G. Pierpont. And if you look in the back of that volume, you have an article there that was written by Robinson. Here it's given the title Appendix, The Case for Byzantine Priority, by Maurice Robinson. It begins on page 533 in this printed edition. There's a note here that says, this essay was presented as part of the Symposium on New Testament Studies, a time for reappraisal, held at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, Wake Forest, North Carolina, April 6 and 7, 2000. It was previously published in the internet resource TC, a Journal of Biblical Textual Criticism, Volume 6, in 2001. So this article has been around for a long time. Maurice Robinson presented it as a paper in 2000. Then it was published in this online text criticism journal in 2001. So it's been around for 23 years. It's printed, in print as an appendix in this Byzantine text form 2005. And what is of interest to me is the second section of this, which appears on pages 534 to 538 in this book. And it has a heading, underheading, a problem of modern eclecticism, sequential variant units, and the resultant original text. And this is where Maurice Robinson puts forward this argument that Thomas Ross was also using, and I think was in part at least dependent upon, the idea that there's a weakness in the modern critical text because it has various phrases and sequences that you cannot find in any extant Greek manuscripts. So it's using an eclectic method, giving us a text that you can't find was in use in what we now have among the extant Greek manuscripts. And so what I want to do is just read this short section from Maurice Robinson's The Case for Byzantine Priority. Now, obviously, I don't hold the same view as Maurice Robinson. He is a Byzantine priority advocate. I advocate for the Protestant text, the confessional text. So with respect to the New Testament, that would be the Textus Receptus. But there are many times, obviously, when those who are advocates for the majority text or the Byzantine text are co-belligerents with those of us who hold to the Textus Receptus over against the modern critical text. So let me see if I can pull up Maurice Robinson's article. It is found a number of places online. So if you do some searching around, you can find this article online and read it for yourself. I think it will be very rewarding for you if you do so. And so this is actually the article as it appears on what is it called? The Journal of Biblical Textual Criticism. So here it's laid out in a little bit different format than it is in the printed format you find as an appendix in Maurice Robinson's Greek New Testament. In this online version, the paragraphs are numbered. And what I'm interested in is, after the introduction, this next rather short segment, which again has the title, A Problem of Modern Eclecticism, Sequential Variant Units, and the Resultant So-Called Original Text. And you can see that it's going to cover paragraphs 4 through 10. So just 7 brief paragraphs are covered here. And so I'm just going to read through this, and maybe we'll make some comments along the way. Might go down to the footnotes a couple times and see the references. So here is this excerpt from Maurice Robinson's The Case for Byzantine Priority, beginning at paragraph 4. Robinson writes, modern eclectic praxis operates on a variant unit basis without any apparent consideration of the consequences. The resultant situation is simple. The best modern eclectic texts simply have no proven existence within transmissional history, and their claim to represent the autograph or the closest approximation thereunto cannot be substantiated from the extant manuscript, versional, or patristic data. That is a really important sentence. This is the one that if you had the print copy of this, you should underline. The resultant situation is simple. The best modern eclectic texts simply have no proven existence within transmissional history. That is, you can't find, by and large, the modern eclectic text existing in extant manuscript showing that it was transmitted, copied, and used by churches and by Christians. And their claim to represent the autograph or the closest approximation thereunto cannot be substantiated from the manuscript evidence, the versional evidence, or the evidence from the church fathers. Let me continue. Calvin L. Porter has noted pointedly that modern eclecticism, although, quote, not based upon a theory of the history of the text, does reflect a certain presupposition about that history. It seems to assume that very early the original text was rent, torn apart, piecemeal, and so carried to the ends of the earth, where the textual critic, like lamenting Isis, must seek it by his skill. Great point. What are they saying? That the text was torn apart, and now the modern scholars like Isis must put it back together. Such a scenario, he continues, imposes an impossible burden upon textual restoration, since not only is the original text no longer extant in any known manuscript or text type, but no manuscript or group of manuscripts reflects such in its overall pattern of readings. There thus remains no transmissional guide to suggest how such an original text would appear when found. One should not be surprised to find that the only certain conclusions of modern eclecticism seem to be that the original form of the New Testament text, A, will not resemble the Byzantine text form, but B, will resemble the Alexandrian text type. So he is calling them out for their presuppositions, their bias against the Byzantine text or the majority text, and their bias in favor of the minority readings of the Alexandrian text type. And so basically what he's saying is that textual restoration using the modern method is really a dead end. He continues, paragraph 5. It is one thing for modern eclecticism to defend numerous readings when considered solely as isolated units of variation. It is quite another matter for modern eclecticism to claim that the sequential result of such isolated decisions will produce a text closer to the autograph or canonical archetype than that produced by any other method. While all eclectic methods utilize what appear to be sufficient internal and external criteria to provide a convincing and persuasive case for an original reading in any given point of variation, strangely lacking is any attempt to defend the resultant sequential text as a transmissional entity. That last part is also very important for those with ears to hear. They claim that they can reconstruct the original, but then they have no concern for how the supposed original appears in any transmissional entity. If the reading they say is original doesn't appear in any extant manuscripts or in a large number of manuscripts that were used, how does it show that it was actually transmitted and used within communities of Christians within the church? He continues, the lay reader can be overwhelmingly convinced regarding any individual eclectic decision due to its apparent plausibility, consistency, and presumed credibility. Arguments offered at this level are persuasive. A major problem arises, however, as soon as those same readings are viewed as a connected sequence. At such a point, the resultant text must be scrutinized in transmissional and historical terms. So what he's saying is, to the layman, sometimes the arguments of the modern critics for a particular reading may be convincing, but when you look at the connected sequence of their preferred reading and find that you don't find it in sequence appearing in any extant manuscripts, it undermines the validity of their findings. Let's move on to paragraph 6. Colwell, and that's the scholar E.C. Colwell, noted that, quote, Westcott and Hort's genealogical method slew the Textus Receptus, end quote. Westcott and Hort appealed to a purely hypothetical stemma of dissent, which they quote, did not apply to the manuscripts of the New Testament, end quote. Yet they claim thereby to, quote, show clearly that a majority of manuscripts is not necessarily to be preferred as correct, end quote. Possibility, which is all that was claimed, does not amount to probability. The latter requires evidence, which the former does not. As Colwell noted, by an, quote, a priori possibility, end quote, Westcott and Hort could, quote, demolish the argument based on the numerical superiority urged by adherents of the Textus Receptus, end quote. The TR, and for all practical purposes, the Byzantine text form, thus was overthrown on the basis of a hypothesis which was not demonstrable as probable. Hort's reader of the schematic chart was left uninformed about the diagrammed possibility which discredited the Byzantine text form was not only unprovable, but highly improbable in light of transmissional considerations. Thus, on the basis of unproven possibilities, the Westcott-Hort theory postulated its, quote, Syrian or Byzantine recension, end quote, of circa AD 350. So again, he's making the argument that Westcott and Hort did not take into consideration, again, the transmission of the New Testament text in their rejection of readings that were supported by the majority of extant readings. They rejected those in favor of the so-called, when they were using text types, the Alexandrian readings, or as they saw them, the neutral text. Let's move on to look at paragraph 8. No, sorry, paragraph 7 we're on. A parallel exists. Modern eclecticism faces a greater problem than did the Byzantine text under the theoretical stemma of Westcott and Hort. Not only does its resultant text lack genealogical support within transmissional theory, but it fails the probability test as well. That the original text, or anything close to such, would fail to perpetuate itself sequentially within reasonably short sections is a key weakness affecting the entire modern eclectic theory and method. The problem is not that the entire text of a New Testament book or even a chapter might be unattested by a single manuscript. Most manuscripts, including those of the Byzantine text form, have unique or divergent readings within any extended portion of text. No two manuscripts agree completely in all particulars. However, the problem with the resultant sequential aspect of modern eclectic theory is that its preferred text repeatedly can be shown to have no manuscript support over even short stretches of text, and at times even within a single verse. The problem increases geometrically as a sequence of variants extends over 2, 3, 5, or more verses. This raises serious questions about the supposed transmissional history required by eclectic choice. As with Hort's genealogical appeal to a possible but not probable transmission, it is transmissionally unlikely that a short sequence of variants would leave no supporting witnesses within the manuscript tradition. The probability that such would occur repeatedly is virtually nil. Let's go back and look a little more closely at those last couple of sentences. So he says that the problem with the modern critical text is that it repeatedly suggests a text, again, that doesn't appear in extant manuscripts. So it repeatedly suggests texts that have no known manuscript support over even short stretches of text, and at times even within a single verse. Let's look at the footnote here, footnote 16, which says, as examples which could be multiplied, he gives the following. First, Matthew 20, verse 23, contains 7 variant units, only 3 of which, the first, second, and sixth, are sufficient to leave the resultant text of Nestle-Aland 27, he was dealing with the 27th edition at the time he wrote this, with no support. Second, he gives as an example, Luke 6:26 contains 5 variant units, which together leave the NA 27 text without support. 3, Mark 11:3 contains but 2 variant units in which the witnesses to the NA 27 text are mutually exclusive. He gives a variant 1, variant 2. His fourth example, John 6:23, with 4 variant units, needs but the second and third to produce an NA 27 verse with no support. For additional examples, he suggests we see his article, and I think this is what Ross made reference to. I'm not sure he listed Robinson's name, but I think I saw this title show up in one of the slides, Investigating Text Critical Dichotomy, a critique of modern eclectic praxis from a Byzantine priority perspective. And that appeared in Faith and Mission, which is a journal of Southeastern Seminary, volume 16 in 1999, found on pages 17 to 19. So let me go back, if we can, to this paragraph. So he lists those that occur within a single verse, and then he says the problem increases geometrically as a sequence of variants extends over 2, 3, 5, or more verses. And so let's look at footnote 17, where he gives as scattered examples. First, Acts 17:26 is supported by manuscripts Papyrus 74, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, Minuscule 33, etc. If verse 27 is added, support drops to just Vaticanus and Minuscule 33. So you see what he's saying, that if you look at Acts 17:26, the reading that's there in the Nestle-Aland 28th edition or 27th edition is found only in these handful of manuscripts. But if you extend now and look at Acts 17:26, and you look also at verse 27, that sequence is only supported, as it reads in the modern critical text, is supported only by 2 manuscripts, by Vaticanus and 33. Now, he continues, after verse 28, only manuscript 33 remains. So if you look at the sequence, verse 26, verse 27, verse 28, that sequence in Acts 17 of text is only supported by 1 extant manuscript, Minuscule 33. Then, if verse 29 is added, the resultant text can no longer be found in any extant Greek manuscript. That's what this is what William Ross was talking about in the debate, and this is what James White seems never to have understood: the problem of sequential variation in the modern critical text. The second example he gives, and I pulled this down so I could see it better, is from Mark chapter 7, verse 24, with 5 units of variation, is supported in toto only by manuscript L. Mark 7:25 with 4 variant units is supported in toto only by manuscript B. If the 2 verses are taken together, no extant manuscript supports the resultant text. So again, this is a pretty strong argument, a transmissional argument against the modern critical text. And it was odd, I think, that James White seems to be unaware of this argument. Let's move on and look now at paragraph 8 of these paragraphs we're looking at, paragraphs 4 through 10. Paragraph 8, Maurice Robinson continues, modern eclecticism creates a text which, within repeated short sequences, rapidly degenerates into one possessing no support among manuscripts, versional, or patristic witnesses. The problem deteriorates further as the scope of sequential variation increases. Let's go ahead and look at the footnote for this as well. Footnote 18. He cites here the introduction of Westcott and Hort, who acknowledge this as regards the variant units in Mark 14 rather, verse 30, Mark 14:68, Mark 14:72, A and B, saying the confusion of attestation is so great that of the 7 principal manuscripts, which would be Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, CDLD, no 2 have the same text in all 4 places, end quote. The NA 27 variants from Mark 14:72 alone leave the text with no manuscript support. Let's continue. One of the complaints against the Byzantine text form has been that such could not have existed at an early date due to the lack of a single pre-4th century manuscript reflecting the specific pattern of agreement characteristic of that text form, even though the Byzantine text form can demonstrate its specific pattern within the vast majority of witnesses from at least the 4th century onward. Yet those who use the modern eclectic text are expected to accept a proffered so-called original, which similarly lacks any pattern of agreement over even a short stretch of a text that would link it with rather what is found in any manuscript, group of manuscripts, version, or patristic witnesses in the entire manuscript tradition. Such remains a perpetual crux for the original text of modern eclecticism. If a legitimate critique can be made against the Byzantine text form because early witnesses fail to reflect its specific pattern of readings, the current eclectic models, regardless of edition, can be criticized more severely since their resultant texts demonstrate a pattern of readings even less attested among the extant witnesses. The principle of Occam's razor applies. And what's the principle of Occam's razor? He points out here it's known in 2 complementary forms. A plurality should not be assumed without necessity, and it is useless to do with more what can be done with fewer. And so I guess Occam's razor is dumbed down to the simplest explanation is sometimes the best. And what he's saying is that the modern critical eclectic method really makes too complicated or overcomplicated what should be something that is relatively simple, and that is the traditional text, obviously supported in most places by the majority of extant manuscripts, and obviously this shows its use in the transmission of early Christians, and therefore we would accept this as the proper text as opposed to the cobbled together modern critical text. Again, I'm not an advocate for the majority text or Byzantine priority, because I do believe that the original text is sometimes supported by minority readings, but I do think this is a very effective argument against the modern critical text. He continues, let me go back to the principle of Occam's razor applies, and the cautious scholar seriously must ask which theory possesses the fewest speculative or questionable points when considered from all angles. Let's move on to paragraph 9. Modern eclectic proponents fail to see their resultant text as falling under a greater condemnation, even though such a text is not only barely possible to imagine having occurred under any reasonable historical process of transmission, but whatever transmissional history would be required to explain the resultant text is not even remotely probable to have occurred under any normal circumstances. Yet modern eclectics continue to reject a lesser argument ex silentio from silence regarding the likelihood of Byzantine propagation in areas outside of Egypt during the early centuries where archaeological data happens not to be forthcoming, while their own reconstructed text requires a hypothetical transmissional history which transcends the status of the text in all centuries. The parallels do not compare well. So they're critical of the so-called Byzantine text because it doesn't appear in pre-4th century manuscripts, particularly in places like Egypt. But what he's countering is, well, listen, your modern critical text doesn't show up in transmission history anywhere, not in the Western world, not in the Byzantine Empire, not even in Egypt. And so your modern eclectic text doesn't show itself to have appeared historically in the transmission of churches. Let's move on to the 10th and final paragraph here, of paragraphs 4 through 10. Maurice Robinson writes, it seems extremely difficult to maintain archetype or autograph authenticity for any artificially constructed eclectic text when such a text taken in sequence fails to leave its pattern or reconstructible traces within even one extant witness to the text of the New Testament. This is especially so when other supposedly secondary text types and text forms are preserved in a reasonable body of extant witnesses with an acceptable level of reconstructability. So again, he's taking them to task. If you're saying that the modern reconstructed text is the original, why do we fail to find it in even one extant witness to that text? Now, again, I'm not an advocate for the majority text. I think there are problems with the majority text or Robinson's Byzantine priority method, because in the end, it is also simply an eclectic method. And there's a problem because there are many places, like in the book of Revelation, where there aren't enough extant manuscripts to determine with any certainty what the so-called majority text or what the Byzantine text is. So instead of the majority text, obviously I reject that, and I would say, let's go with the Protestant standard. Let's go with the Textus Receptus. Let's go with the text that seems to have been providentially preserved, printed, and used for the preaching of the gospel from the time of the Reformation. And this is an affirmation of that text. Again, though here we're co-belligerents, because we can both see significant problems with the modern critical text, as again, it provides us readings that across the sequence within various verses, we find that it doesn't provide a text for us that was known, seems to have been known in any extant manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. It's a kind of a complicated argument. I hope that maybe our reviewing this little section has helped to clarify it a little bit for those who are listening. And again, the idea here is to put forward this portion of the article simply to supplement the discussion we were having about the debate between James White and Thomas Ross. James White really didn't have an answer for this objection. I'm not sure if he wasn't familiar with the previous work done by Maurice Robinson, but I would love to hear a response from James White or one of the other advocates for the modern critical text, maybe even those who say, I like the modern critical text. I'm a modern critical text guy. I love modern translations. Have you dealt with the issue that your translations are based on a text that oftentimes, believe it or not, are not based on sequences of text that can be found in any extant manuscripts? And so your text is based on an eclectic method that can't show any historical roots in the transmissional history of the New Testament. So it is a very cogent, very strong objection against the modern critical text. And I think Thomas Ross was very right to put forward this argument, although I'm, again, not sure how much his opponent really was able to understand it. He certainly didn't articulate a cogent response to it. Well, with that, I'm going to bring this episode of Word Magazine to a close. I hope this has been helpful to those who are listening, and I'll look forward to speaking to you in the next Word Magazine. Till then, take care and God bless.